Welcome to the Optimistic Curmudgeon, where the best ideas win. I'm your host, Josh Herring. My guest today is Dr. Scott Yenor. Dr. Yenor is a political science professor at Boise State University and a Washington Fellow at the Claremont Institute Center for the American Way of Life. He is most recently the author of The Recovery of Family Life, Exposing the Limits of Modern Ideologies. Dr. Yenor, welcome back to the Optimistic Curmudgeon.
Thanks for having me back, Josh.
I so enjoyed our last conversation. I was also really happy that you were up for this again. Before we get into the report that we're talking about today, I'd love it if you could tell us a bit about the Claremont Institute and your work with them as a Washington Fellow. What all's involved in that?
Well, Claremont has always been a think tank on the West Coast, and a few years ago we established a think tank on the East Coast in DC called the Center for the American Way of Life. And the purpose of the Center for the American Way of Life is to protect the great and unique things about America, the regime of natural rights and equality of before the law, against the threats that exist today, coming primarily from identity politics and such. So my portfolio there has been to show the ways in which our education system has been threatened by the identity politics ideologies, especially feminism, critical race theory, queer theory, and things. And I also have worked in the feminism lane to show the ways in which feminism itself has undermined the American way of life. That is based on the assumption that you're not going to get a great America without a great set of families. There's no great nations without great families, and feminism itself is a threat, says it is a threat and is a threat to such great families. So it's been part of my portfolio to show how that's the case and how feminism erodes the American way of life. So basically, my portfolio has been about universities and feminism, and how that those two ideologies or those two places pose specific dangers to the American way of life. And Claremont Center for the American Way of Life is really trying to be very practical about how the identity politics ideology, has threatened America through public policy and through shaping the culture.
Well, I'm really glad to hear that. I wasn't aware of the Claremont Institute's East Coast presence. I occasionally take a look through the Claremont Review of Books, and I know Hillsdale College has a really strong relationship with Claremont since Dr. Arnn came to Hillsdale from Claremont, if I remember that correctly. Yeah. But I didn't know they had that DC presence. That's really exciting. And those areas they seem simultaneously to be really pernicious, and like the progressive left has worked its way into all these different facets of American life, but that seemingly have gone unopposed. So I'm glad to hear that's something you're trying to raise awareness of and are writing towards, raising more awareness about kind of those problems, and that there are strong intellectual voices on the conservative right that are trying to really conserve this particularly American way of living.
Yeah, conservatives have to start taking stock of our failures. And it brings us no joy to do that, but we have to start figuring out, why what we have done in the past has failed to, say, move the needle on higher ed. The percentage of professors who are left-leaning in higher ed, goes up every year as old people retire and as newbies enter into the profession, into the academy. Free speech is what conservatives have emphasized over the last 20 years, 30 years in criticizing the higher ed industry. Like, that hasn't gotten the job done. And conservatives have opposed affirmative action or racial preferences. That hasn't gotten the job done. The university system have continued to drift to the left and have corroded the foundation for an appreciation for Western civilization, for Christendom. And so something has to be done. And so first we have to take stock in what we've done and give an account of why it has failed, and then figure out where we are. And that's one of the things we're hoping to do, and I think have done. And much the same thing is true of feminism. we joke that conservatives sometimes say, well, conservatives are the real feminists. And it's like, no, we're the real opponents of feminism. And we have to probably isolate ourselves from not just from the most pernicious excesses of feminism, but also from its very foundations in order to defend the American way of life. So that's, I think a needful thing and something that we're trying to undertake.
Wow. Very, very good work for sure. I think last time we talked, I was still in much earlier stages in the dissertation process. I've since finished 2 chapters, and the first chapter I used your book, The Recovery of Family Life, and particularly kind of the way you traced feminism. What I found most helpful in there was really, I think you point out a link there that I don't think very many people pay too much attention to. You focus specifically on the way that feminism decouples the idea of gender from the body, and that then this whole and it's sort of the way you tell the story, feminism is trying to really eradicate actual women, which I found was just a very helpful way of thinking about it, because there's a bit of a rhetorical shift that takes place in my mind, where like I don't want to be opposed to feminism if that means I'm trying to tell all women everywhere they have to be oppressed. There's sort of feminism sort of got the rhetorical high ground by using the language of liberation early, but very quickly pulling the sort of bait and switch, where that liberation is actually trading the reality of what it means to be a woman for basically being an inferior version of a man and trying to do very manly activities in a less good way, and then being societally praised for that. I thought you did a very good job kind of picking that apart and highlighting here exactly is why feminism, as it's currently, as it's evolved over the past, say, 80 years, is really against actual women. And I really liked I'm not sold on the the term, but I loved your idea of sort of we need an ideological sense of womanism that is encouraging women to be the most thoroughly themselves they possibly can be, which I thought was just a very helpful way to think about feminism and where are we today in terms of social and legal equality is here, but I keep running into women who are really, really unhappy with the way that society has kind of pushed them into the workforce, into leadership roles, and it all comes with a cost, and it's of course the cost of hearth and home and children typically, and so I really appreciate the work that you do in that area. I think it's very, very helpful.
Well, thank you. My shtick on that is that feminism is one of the last stages of modern attacks on nature, attempts to conquer nature, and the body is one of the last obstacles. And so feminism really defines a woman against her body. So the new idea of what is going to be honored will not be traced to what a woman's body can do, that is produce and nurture children, but rather like something else, creative work of her own, as Betty Friedan calls it. And yeah, I think that's, it's a new ethic. Feminists really try to trick us, I think, in saying that this is about giving women more choices. No, it's about narrowing the choices that women will dedicate themselves to. I wrote recently that there seem to be, at least the stats that I've seen suggest that there are less than 400 nuns under the age of 40 in the United States. People are free to become nuns, but they don't choose it. And we might want to consider why that might be. Like there's a predominant ethic that points people away from that. And the same thing, though on a larger scale, is true of motherhood. People have fewer, people are free to have as many children as they want. They're free to be mothers, but they choose it less. That's because we have a particular ethic that kind of points people away from making that particular choice. So seeing feminism as an ethic, as something that honors one way of life and dishonors other ways of life, I think is, like one of the things that I want to get through in my work on feminism. So.
Excellent. Well, listeners, I promise we're not going to take all of our time today to rehash these themes, but if you're curious for more of these, do go back and check out the first episode in season 3 where Dr. Yenor spent a lot more time on these ideas in discussing his book, The Recovery of Family Life. I will just point out, currently, as of our recording today, that is the most popular episode in season 3. We've had 275 downloads on Podbean and 114 views on YouTube, which I know in the grand scheme of things are very small numbers, but for an up and coming podcast, they're great. So I'm really excited that your episode's been getting some good play. Well, Dr. Yenor, I reached out in part because I saw, I printed it out. I don't have a good screen share with this, so I printed out, held up my PDF copy. I printed out your recent report, Grooming Future Revolutionaries, Woke Indoctrination at K-12 Schools on America's Military Bases, which I found absolutely fascinating. It seems to kind of sit there with a couple other reports 3 or 4 years ago. There was a Manhattan Institute report about woke ideology in Wake County public schools. Wake County is, I think, the 4th largest public school district, at least on the Eastern Seaboard, if not in the country. We're one of the bigger ones. So that report got some press. Christopher Rufo has made sort of a beat out of breaking news about woke indoctrination at various companies, Disney being the biggest one in the last couple of years. But so I'm really kind of curious what you can tell us about what's going on, particularly what was the problem that you identified here, and why is it so concerning that this is happening at K-12 schools on America's military bases? Why is that a unique group of schools that's worth studying?
Well, yeah, there's a lot in that question. So first of all, the report is co-authored with my boss at Claremont Institute, who's the president, Ryan Williams. And what we got was a series of about 50 training videos. So if we back up, let's talk about the schools we're talking about. The schools we're talking about are the schools on military bases. So many members of the military have families. They take them with them when they are overseas. They're stationed overseas. So there'll be schools of varying sizes that are affiliated with or one military base or several, depending on if there's many in the area. And there's about 70,000 people, 70,000 students in this particular system. And I can't even remember how many schools there are, but there are hundreds of schools. And the videos that we got a hold of were videos of how the teachers on the military base schools were being trained. So this was military base school teachers training other military base school teachers. And the predominance of what we call in other contexts critical social justice theories or practices was really all over the training videos. And so we think it's significant because, for a couple of reasons. One is because the particular system that we're talking about here on the military bases is directly supervised by, we'll say, the political appointees in the Department of Defense. So it is it comes down as an order to do this from the political appointees in the Department of Defense. So it shows what our ruling class considers to be an important element, or the important thrust of a modern education. And secondly, and we didn't talk about this directly in the report, but it's something to know, is that the military-based schools are actually, by objective measures, not bad. They're the second best school system in the country behind Massachusetts. And so it'll be interesting to see what kind of effects the particular program that is being implemented in the military-based schools, has on their performance. So we can create a kind of baseline for that. But yeah, so how are the educators being educated? That's what these training videos reveal, and it reveals what is valued by the political class, those who are running the Department of Defense.
Oh man, that's. I'm thinking there's also I know this is probably an unmeasurable factor, but I assume there is some clear correlation relationship between children of military officers who then go into the military themselves. And so there's got to be some future concern about the way we educate the children of current military personnel is also shaping who is probably going to be part of leading the military in 20, 30, or 40 years. Is that also in play?
Totally. I mean, I think you might even take a step back and think about the recruiting crisis that seems to exist in the military. I think they're 50% away from actually hitting their numbers this year. It's about the third or fourth year in a row that they have not got anywhere near their recruitment numbers. And I'm not going to say the lion's share, but there is some significant share of that, which is traceable to the fact that the children of current members of the military are enlisting at like diminished numbers. And if you teach them that the country is inherently racist, and if you undermine patriotic education and teach the kids that they're citizens of the world, if you try to make them into left-wing activists instead of into I'll just say American patriots again, it's no wonder that they will enlist at smaller numbers. And so I think that this is going to be part of the ongoing recruitment crisis that the military already suffers. I mean, it's never a good time to be in the military during peacetime. The peacetime military is not usually on the top of its game. It's not necessarily a total shocker that there's recruitment problems during a time of sustained peace. However, once the military comes to represent, I don't know, the anti-American idea, then you're less likely to have people who love the country enter into the military. And so, yeah, I do think that there's a long-term problem, crisis, question, whether or not people will rise to the occasion if the military kind of, we'll say, takes the other side over the course of time.
I'm just saying this is reminding me of a theme that one of my favorite history professors traced in several of his courses. He was also the military history guy at Hillsdale's history department, and he at least made he noted a pattern. He was very careful to say, you can't really count on this pattern. It may just be in these places. But it was the case across 19th and into 20th century Europe that the military tended to be more conservative than the typical population, and particularly the political class. We're looking particularly in Spain and France, and to some extent in England as well. So for Spain, at least, you have this 19th century Spain as this running series of political crises, and the military was sort of a stable base of traditional Spain in the midst of constant turmoil and turnover in their government. It just seems very interesting to me that I've heard more in the last 2 years about woke issues in the military than I remember in the previous 32. Now, is that an actual problem we have across our military, or are these issues that have been there that are now sort of rising to the surface of national conversation?
Well, yeah, I mean, if let's differentiate two things. Let's differentiate the academies, the military academies, West Point, Annapolis, Colorado Springs. Is that where the Air Force is, right? And typical training on the one hand, and then the military-based schools on the other hand. I think we document this a little bit in the report, but the issues of the academies going woke have been there probably for 6, 8, depending on how you measure it, significantly over the last half a decade. And it's probably the case that the entering class of 2016, so they would be called the class of 2019 at the Air Force, they're the last ones that were overseen by other students as opposed to the administration, so that the initiations and all this stuff that might exist now. You can go back to read speeches by, let's say, Jim Webb, who was an old Secretary of the Navy in the early 1980s. And he says that the academies were already kind of gone at that point because of the admission of women into the academies. But I think the acceleration of this in the last 5 years is obvious to all and very well documented. So, the anti-whiteness training or the white privilege training, the CRT stuff, like that's become the gas pedal has been hit on that in the last 5 years. The military-based schools, the strategic plan for that really only accelerated the CRT stuff in about 2020, and we're now seeing the beginnings of the fruit of that. It's one of the last vestiges within the military that was still immune from, like, we'll just say the woke ideology. Now they're coming for the kids, is what I'm saying, as opposed to the plebes. And so that, it's an issue. It has been an issue for, as I say, half a decade, and now the chickens are coming home to roost in the K through 12 system in the last couple of years.
Well, let's get into some specifics then. There were two phrases that you mentioned that I'd love it if you could help us with some specific examples, because the phrases sound positive. I've seen these used in educational circles, and they sort of, in one sense, they can these can be present and sort of fade into the background. But you identified these as places where there's sort of an Orwellian doublespeak going on. I'm thinking particularly of social and emotional learning. And then the other phrase is trauma-informed practices. Could you walk us through sort of both halves of that? What's sort of the public rhetoric around those phrases, but then also what did your report find is actually happening with those ideas in the classroom?
Yeah. All right. Well, that's a big question. So I want to zoom out and then I'll try to come back in a little bit. So, the whole aim of, we'll call it the woke movement, both on race and on gender, is to look at the current society and say, those structures are oppressive. They're pigeonholing people into like racial roles or heterosexual roles, or they're encouraging women to be mothers. The system as it currently exists is oppressive. And there's a promise, though, that at the end of the day, we can liberate people from these oppressive structures and have this kind of new humanity on the other end. And this exists everywhere. This critique of American society exists everywhere. So it affects the cops. Our drug laws are forms of racial oppression, they say. And therefore, we need to minimize their effect on people of color. And so we need bail reform, and we need to have shorter prison sentences. We just need to let people out of prison. And this is the movement of liberation. We need Soros prosecutors to oversee their non-prosecutions. And we're seeing this on higher ed. The oppressive structure of the old curriculum still exists. Blacks do worse in school. So we need to change our admission standards, or we need to have no standards. And that way we're going to liberate people from it. Now, the general critique when it comes to race is called critical race theory. But no one really talks about critical race theory with the cops. They say abolish the police. No one really talks about critical race theory when it comes to higher ed. They say diversity, equity, and inclusion. Mm-hmm. And in K through 12, critical race theory kind of makes its way into the curriculum, into the daily practices of schools, not coming under the name critical race theory, not calling itself gender theory, but instead it calls itself transformative social and emotional learning, or it calls itself restorative justice, or it embraces trauma-induced practices, so that this large theory comes under different words, under different covers in all of these different facets of American life. And so when we're dealing with critical race theory or gender theory or queer theory in K through 12, it comes in the form of social and emotional learning, or it comes in the form of trauma-induced practices, but it's always doing the same thing. It's always the current structure is bad, but there's this promise of liberation from the current structure if we do like this policy. So so social and emotional learning, like it sounds like it's shaping habits so that students will be in a better position to succeed and exercise self-control. And that's actually the first iteration of social and emotional learning. But it always is the leading edge toward this other thing called transformative social and emotional learning, which is to kind of manipulate the emotions of students so that they recognize, in cases of white students, their own privilege, they feel guilty about it, and they're willing to like let BIPOCs, Black, Indigenous, people of color, lead the conversation or determine the nature of the curriculum. It's designed to get people to question their own identities, their sexual identities, and therefore to be open to liberating the iron cage of gender, people from the iron cage of gender, so that they will be open to queer theories and transgenderism. So like one thing that teachers are encouraged to do is to always use their own pronouns. So one of the videos says, look, ask students what pronouns they would like to be identified as. And in the beginning, they're just gonna like say, what are you talking about? But like we want them to learn to question the pronouns that are associated with their own identity. So you do that by calling into question, like, well, would you like to be called by those pronouns again today? Ask them every day. And eventually they'll say, oh, this is actually a questionable thing. And once they're open to questioning it, then encourage them to keep questioning it. This is liberating them from the oppressive structures through like various techniques that are part of social and transformative social and emotional learning. The same thing happens with things like trauma-induced practices. What that is you start class off with a kind of arresting tale that gets people to see the oppressive structures that they otherwise wouldn't see. So you tell them, say, the other day I was walking on an escalator. I'm just going to borrow this from a prominent Black scholar. I was walking on an escalator, and a lady saw me. I'm a Black man, and she put her purse from one side of her body to the other side of the body, so that she, was protecting it from the possibility that I might be a thief. And then, how would that make you feel if someone did that in front of you? So the trauma can usually be more traumatic. I'm just making this up as I'm going along here, but I'm just giving you an example. It's designed to get people to identify the oppressive structure and to like question the way they're living their lives so that they can embrace the anti-racist ideology that would tear down such apparently discriminatory things.
This all sounds like a giant time-consuming set of exercises. I know it has been maybe less the philosophy side, but more the very practical side. Whenever I get a group of teachers together, one of the first things they're concerned with is time in seat. And one of the most measured facets of education is the amount of time students spend on a subject. Surprise, surprise, directly correlates to progress in that subject. So it's just one of the things that teachers are always really worried about. If every Thursday afternoon, the last period of the day gets 20 minutes less of time, that teacher is usually ready to go in and complain to the principal. Don't be surprised when my test scores are a little bit lower because I've lost, and they'll usually count up the minutes. But this sounds like all of these things would take time that are not in the standards. If I'm teaching history, there's nothing in my standards that says I should stop and do
But there are things in the standards.
Oh, do
like,
tell, please.
This is the new standard. So, I mean, I'm sure you've noted that test scores on reading and math and science and these other things have been going down around the country. And well, part of the reason for that might be that this is actually like the thing that's being emphasized in curricula, as opposed to the actual mastery of material. So, yeah, I mean, it is a time suck from the perspective of teaching traditional, school subjects. But if this is now the goal of education, then it's not a time suck. It's actually the proper way of, allocating your time. There's one story that one teacher told, during one of the training sessions that we had, about trying to get the school had a homecoming court, and it had a king and a queen. And over the course of weeks, she tried to get students to that's too much of an iron cage. What about gay students? Why don't we just call it a court instead of a king and a queen? And she just tried to make the argument, and she allowed the students to vote, and she just tried to persuade them that this was the right way to go. And the students ended up voting to keep the king and the queen. And, she's disappointed that she hadn't made enough progress with them. She needs to really redouble her efforts over the course of the next year in order to get rid of the whole idea of the homecoming court. But I mean, I'm just using this to illustrate the point that this is the point. This is not an accident or a sideshow. This is the point of education today. And so it's no wonder, no one cares that the test scores are going down. That's not a bug. It's a feature.
Oh my. Well, I wonder if you can give us some more examples of, I jotted some phrases down that you've given us some of these already, I think, but these at least were 4 problem areas that seemed really significant that your report identified. You talked about cutting edge left-wing propaganda techniques, radical gender ideology. I noted you mentioned a teacher, part of this training included teaching people how to use the genderbread illustration in the classroom. And then the phrase white shaming and anti-racism. I've got one other one that I'll come back to after that. But any thoughts or particular examples you want to share about those 3 areas?
Yeah, I mean, we've talked about some of it already. I mean, just you have to recognize that what teachers are being taught to do in this particular setting is to encourage students to recognize their own white privilege, or the ways in which the world is, unjustly organized around the idea that there are men and women, and the way in which the world secretly favors, I'll say, man-woman relations over man-man or woman-woman relations, and then to think that that's bad, it's bad that the world does all that stuff. So and there's there's books, there's teaching techniques, there's activities in the class, all of which can be designed to expose those particular secret structures of oppression in the world. One of them that you just mentioned is this book, The Genderbread Man. Now, don't ask me to recount the plot of this thing, but it's a chart that tries to show that that one's gender identity is plotted along 4 factors. How do you like? I can't remember all the 4 factors about this because it's been a while since I've read the book, and I wish I had the report open so I could just quickly turn to it. But so say who you're sexually attracted to, what kind of clothes do you like to wear, What do you feel inside about yourself? So that all of these things are questionable, and then you put yourself on a spectrum, and at the end of the day, you can find out like which one of the particular genders are you. But this is all pitched to 6-year-olds. Like it's based on this vision of the gingerbread man, but it's the genderbread man. And so you're asking little kids like, do you like to sew? Oh, maybe you think you're a girl. And we can identify you on various places, even though I don't think girls even sew anymore, but that's another matter. And that's our feminism discussion. And so we can plot where your gender is. And this becomes like something that is done in the classroom. Another thing, maybe the most pernicious thing that is done in the whole training, is to attempt to imagine that trust exists only between teachers and students, so that students begin to call into question and keep secrets from their parents. Like this is something they're encouraged to do. Like, do you ever feel like you have a crush on someone? Do you ever feel like your identity is not what you're being told it is at home? And, and to try to sow skepticism into the relation between parents and children, and to build trust between the supposedly objective and just sitting there listening teachers and the kid. And like the promise to keep things from parents about one's gender identity, like all of that is a big deal. And it's once again, it's not just an accident. It's the view that kids really don't, we'll say, belong to their parents, or the parents aren't primarily responsible for the kids, but rather the state and its agents are primarily responsible for the kids. And that the state's job is to call into question these given aspects of their identity. And the teacher is the tip of the spear when it comes to doing that. And there's lots of techniques for accomplishing this. And the videos that we put forward show some of those.
I think it's really interesting, and it's kind of terrifying at the exact same time. Because everything you're describing is sort of, I can hear teachers who lean left or centrist framing this in terms of like critical thinking. And yet when you put it in terms of like, these are concepts being presented to a 6-year-old, the critical thinking argument, I think, sort of evaporates. Because what we're dealing with are things that, these are fixed realities. These are fixed, assumed points that students need to be able to count on, so that they can learn to interact with each other in a just way. And yet, by calling all those into question and kind of pairing that with a trusted authority figure, the teacher, who, if the teacher has done his or her job correctly, there's a strong relationship there. What's also terrifying, and I assume ties into your slightly provocative title about grooming future revolutionaries. I'm assuming that was not an accidental verb in your title, or the title of your report with Ryan Williams. There's a lot of what you just mentioned that every teacher in America has to go through that we're not allowed to ask about, because those are the marks of being a sexual predator. If I, as a mid-30s male, ask a student about like attraction, or make too many comments about clothing, or like, those are literally red flags that another teacher should report me to administration about, like having an unhealthy interest in a child. And yet these are the very things that teachers are then being coached on. One of the pieces I just wanted to make sure we do get in, just in case any of our audience is kind of unaware of the role these sorts of trainings play. And I'm speaking from the private school world, that I assume is only more true in the public school world, because they have licensure requirements and CEUs and all that. Teaching is a training heavy profession. If you just look at it from the outside and you think, oh my goodness, you can't throw a rock and not hit an educational consultant somewhere in America. But in the actual work of the school year, it's very rare to have moments where teachers are out of the classroom and out of grading and are actually given training. In a private school setting, we tend to have one, maybe two of those a year. And those kind of moments are crucial for just equipping teachers with tools, with vision, with alignment kind of concerns. in a public school setting where your teachers have to meet licensure requirements, they have to seek out professional development or go through their institutional professional development to a certain amount each year. Those kind of things then become the background that teachers draw on when they're trying to think through, have I done my job this year? And I'm imagining not sort of the closet revolutionary teacher. I'm imagining the newly hired teacher who went through a standard teacher training program and has the best of intentions and wants to move up the ladder. And that teacher's first question is, have I done what I'm supposed to do in my job? And professional development moments like the trainings that we're talking about, those are what shape teachers' visions of whether or not they've done their job. So when these kind of trainings, that presumably a once or twice a year kind of all teacher gathering to know, this is really what we're emphasizing this year. Make sure you hit pronouns. Make sure you hit structural oppression narratives. Make sure this happens. That all kind of gets filed away, and it gets added to the list, the checklists that determine salaries, advancement, department chair kind of things. That administrators are then looking for to evaluate whether teachers are doing or not. So I say all that to say, just to emphasize to our audience that this really does matter. Like this really is part of what is in the warp and weft of mainstream education today. Any other comments?
Yeah, the only thing I would add to that is it's also true that the teachers who conduct the seminars and the training are being honored with the place of saying this is an authoritative voice for what it means to be a teacher.
Yep.
And so that not only does it show the route toward raises, but also public honor, which I think is very crucial in determining the nature of these institutions, so that that these teachers are, as they might say, being platformed over other teachers, shows what is valued, and if you want to be valued as a member of this particular teaching profession, this is what you want to look like. So yeah, I like what you said there. I think it's true. And we also have, in addition to that, the issue of honor.
I think that's crucial. Well, Dr. Yenor, let's shift towards maybe a little bit more of a positive approach. I noticed as we got towards the end of the report, you started contrasting everything we've been discussing about kind of this focus or this addition with the what you called key American notions like colorblindness, meritocracy, and Republican self-government. Could you walk us through what these key notions are and why you think they belong at the core of American education, particularly for children of military personnel?
Yeah, I mean, we could take a couple of these. I mean, you know, the ideologues who lead these trainings and, you know, are standing on the backs of other people who have put forward fundamental critiques of the American way, and they criticize notions like colorblindness, meritocracy, and Republican self-government. Those are the three that I mentioned there. There are others that fall on the list. And they criticize it because those notions actually produce inequalities. So that colorblind policies, say like giving the SAT, seems like a very colorblind thing. And we've been very worried about the cultural narrative that might inform the SAT or ACT for years. But it's still necessarily, or I shouldn't say necessarily, but it still has, over the course of time, produced unequal outcomes. So while it appears that the SAT is colorblind, blacks do worse, Asians do better, and whites are in the middle and closer to Asians and blacks, but their blacks are about a standard deviation below whites. So there must be something wrong with the standard. And the same thing is true about meritocracy. Like for whatever reason, you look at physicists in the United States, there are a lot of Asians. They're like out of proportion in their population. So whites less so, but also true. and there are very few Black physicists. I mean, who knows why that's the case, but it is. And so that must mean that there's something secretly built into the notion of being a physicist that detracts from merit. Like this idea of merit is what we use to justify this inequality, but it's really just a system of racism. And like the only alternative to this is to like embrace the idea that our practices are colorblind, and we have the stomach for the inequalities. That we think the inequalities that are produced are like the result of genuine differences for traceable to whatever. But nevertheless, these institutions that we have, we think are very valuable. And like we think it's like people who commit violence in school should be suspended, regardless of the racial disparity that might come about from suspending people for committing violence against other students. You can't have a learning environment with violence. And but you know, like that's going to be looked at as like apparently colorblind, but secretly an institution of racial subordination. So, you know, we have to like recognize what we are defending. We are defending standards that are central to a civilized country. No civilized country can exist without such standards. And these standards are in themselves good. And they're persistent. They've coexisted with slavery and Jim Crow, but they aren't defined by slavery and Jim Crow. And the attempt to erode such standards and replace them, frankly, with different standards that imply the inequality of the law is just going to like undermine the fabric of any civilization. And we're kind of seeing that in some of our inner cities now, where different standards for whites and blacks are finding their way into law, where we're trying to, if not abolish or defund the police, we're trying to decrease their effect on the world. And so I think there's no way around the idea that civilization requires standards, and the standards include the rule of law and the recognition of inequalities where they exist and serve the public, and that these institutions are hostile to those ideas in their nature. So we have to like be defending those standards.
That's a great kind of clear way of describing it. I'll only add that you mentioned the SAT. That took me back to a debate resolution my team had a couple years ago where we were debating about whether or not the SAT or colleges should go test optional. This was before COVID, before colleges actually all pretty uniformly went test optional. And one of the biggest arguments I try to convince my students to run on NEG was that actually colorblindness and meritocracy lead to the most just system, and that we will never have a perfectly just system in this world, but actually having a fair test that if you can perform to a certain level on this test, you get access to these kinds of social goods, and having that test be fairly accessible to everybody, and there being free study aids out the wazoo in every public library in America, and then on the internet everywhere. All of that leads ultimately to all kinds of actual success stories where people who, if you just look at their backgrounds and their ethnic stories, you would never expect them to get into big name colleges. And yet, because they put the work in, they achieve a certain score and they then have access to these. And that's actually far more just than abolishing the standard, which all of a sudden removes one, even though it's pretty flawed, one quantitative metric for college admissions, thus creating a greater space for wealthy students to be able to tell stories about being in fencing club or the time they studied abroad, that an inner city kid from Detroit is just never going to be able to tell those stories. But now his test score doesn't really matter nearly as much. And so I think it's very interesting to me that we seem to have a societal problem of recognizing that inequalities and hierarchy are simply part of reality. And we will never have a pure equality. And egalitarianism actually only hides a false kind of hierarchy in its midst and requires some other form of injustice. In this case, I think what we tend to functionally get is the sort of positive racism or affirmative action kind of moves that currently have UNC Chapel Hill and Yale University in pretty hot water in front of the Supreme Court. That's a case I'm looking forward to seeing resolve, hopefully in the coming months.
Yeah, I agree with that. That's good.
Well, as we kind of wrap up today, I want to kind of go to your closing. The report closes with a call to action. What could we do nationwide or on local levels to really protect the education of America's military children? And to the extent that these same problems exist in mainstream public education, what could we do that would protect the education of America's youth?
Well, I mean, the judgment that people have to make is, are the institutions of K through 12 education salvageable? And I think that that's a great divide. And my own view is that we're down the road to the point where they're not salvageable. The teacher preparation means the schools of education, the accreditation organizations, the professional organizations and teachers unions, the curriculum developers for America's public schools are all on the same page. And therefore, the best policy is to opt out and destroy. and what I mean by destroy there is our reigning educational establishment is beyond being repaired and regulated to serve the public good. So, we need an education establishment, but our reigning ones are corrupt. And they've been around for a long time. They've been around for 100 years. The teachers unions have existed for at least that long. It's not a shock that they no longer really care about serving the public. So, it's time to find ways to dishonor, disrupt, and defund the reigning education establishment. And so, on military schools, one of the prospects for reform is giving them choice so they can leave the American schools and go to the German schools, which are probably way better. No doubt are way better. That would be true throughout the whole system, so that you'd allow people to opt out or to make their own education in pods or smaller groups, all with the idea that the money that would have gone to the schools will follow those students, just like we talk about here in the States. And so I think that's part of any real solution to this, but not with the idea that think that that's the end goal. The end goal isn't just to be tolerated and to have some sort of carve out, but rather to offer an alternative vision of education that's much more similar to what we may have had in the 1850s or something, that emphasizes literacy and competence in math, a reasonable patriotism, a preparation of young boys and young girls for destinies in different destinies from one another in the world. And it kind of leans into scientific progress as an element of this, but as I say, is accompanied by a genuine appreciation for Western Civ and for the reasonable patriotism in America. So I think curricula that are built around those ideas are now beginning to be developed. It's very late in the game. Conservatives have probably dropped the ball until maybe it's too late on this front. But like Hillsdale Civics curriculum and other curriculum are now being developed and offered. And schools should definitely try to take that up, and legislatures should try to impose such curricula on perhaps unwilling teachers. And so, yeah, I think that there's a two-part strategy that has to be adopted, which is to dishonor and disrupt the current education establishment and to seek to replace it. And as I say, I think there are movements in this, but like homeschooling is not enough. And there needs to be a nationwide effort to craft an alternative that reflects a reasonable patriotism and appreciation for Western civ, and prepares boys and girls for destinies in the modern world.
Love it. Those are great thoughts. Well, Dr. Yenor, thank you so much, and a thank you to Dr. Williams for y'all's work in putting this report together. I think it's helpful, it's clear, and it's at least today has led to a great conversation. So before we go, where can people find and follow your work online?
Oh, various places. I post everything that I do on my Twitter account, which is about the only thing I do put on Twitter. I'm not what they say, what the kids say. I'm not good on Twitter. I don't try, though. I just place my stuff there. And otherwise, you can find it in various websites, Law, Liberty, The American Mind. But I also do a lot of kind of contract work for people on the study of higher ed institutions, and that stuff will only make its way onto my Twitters. So,
oh, excellent. Well, Dr. Yenor, thank you so much for joining me today for this episode. This has been great.
Yeah. Thank you, Josh. Appreciate you having me.
Thank you, listeners, for joining us for this episode of The Optimistic Curmudgeon. My guest this episode has been Dr. Scott Yenor, professor of political science at Boise State University and author of The Recovery of Family Life, Exposing the Limits of Modern Ideology. If you like this episode, please leave us a 5-star review and share it with your friends. Until next time, seek the good, discover the true, and love the beautiful. You've been listening to another episode of The Optimistic Curmudgeon, where the best ideas win. I'm your host, Josh Herring. The Optimistic Curmudgeon is a project of Thales Press. If you enjoyed this episode, please give us a 5-star review and share it with your friends. You can find us on 3 major social media platforms. Search for The Optimistic Curmudgeon on Facebook and LinkedIn, and find us on Twitter at the handle @TheOptimisticC3. This episode was edited and produced by Madison Kay, audio engineer for The Optimistic Curmudgeon. Until next time, seek the good, pursue the true, and love the beautiful.